The end of December. Moscow is already living in anticipation of the holiday. Garlands are shining in the shop windows, street musicians are playing Christmas tunes, and vendors are rushing to the subway stations with Christmas trees and firecrackers. It seems that the city is preparing to forget about all the hard things and plunge into the comfort of a winter fairy tale for at least a few days. The streets are bustling, and there is a premonition of change in the air. But outside the city, on the territory of Vnukovo Airport, the atmosphere is completely different. There are no holiday chores. Everything is strict, cold and technically accurate. The lanes are being cleared of snow, dispatchers are checking weather data, and equipment is preparing planes for departures. Among the dozens of flights where passengers are rushing to get home to their families, there is one that looks different. There is a Red Wings Tu-204 in the parking lot. A huge, snow-white liner with a bright red tail. There is emptiness inside. There were no passengers, no suitcases in the luggage compartment, and no flight attendants checking the cabin. On this flight, no one is being taken to family or on vacation. The plane is simply returning from the Czech Republic to Moscow after a technical operation. There is only a crew on board, pilots and engineers, for whom flying is not an event, but a job. At first glance, this flight should be as safe as possible. There are no people in the cabin, which means less responsibility. There are no urgent schedules and fuss with passengers, which means that the crew can work calmly and with concentration. A routine flight for experienced professionals. But in aviation, it is often in such moments that the danger lies. When it seems that nothing is in danger, attention weakens, and then any little thing can trigger a chain of events. The Tu-204 is itself a symbol of hope. It was designed as the West's response to Boeing and Airbus. Modern avionics and control systems, domestic PS-90 engines, and the ability to compete in the global market. Every time he appeared at the airport, he was supposed to demonstrate that Russian aviation was still capable of building large machines and was proud of them. This particular plane was carrying the national football team in 2010. Then he was surrounded by attention, photos, and applause. The irony is that in just 2 years, his name will be in the reports of a completely different kind. Meanwhile, heavy clouds cover the Moscow sky. The snow ceases to be soft and fluffy, it turns into a prickly wall, which is cut by the flashing lights of airfield vehicles. The wind is picking up, and the dispatchers are recording the first gusts that go beyond the permissible limits. For any pilot, this is a high alert signal. But for the crew of the RW9268, this will be just one of the warning signs ignored in a series of more important tasks, as it seems to them. Everything is still calm. Dispatchers work in a familiar voice, without unnecessary emotions. The huge airport has its own schedule. One plane is taking off, another is preparing to land, and the third is taxiing to the parking lot. Everything is on schedule. And only a few people notice how the Tu-204 Red Wings is approaching from over the horizon. He only has a few minutes left before landing. The contrast is striking. They are preparing to open champagne in the city, and tension is growing in the cockpit of this plane. People who should be the epitome of confidence are internally disconnected. But for now it's hidden from view. Externally, it's still a regular flight. The usual landing. An ordinary day. Only after a short time will the calm picture change beyond recognition. Instead of a regular landing, a catastrophic roll, out beyond the runway. Instead of pride in the domestic liner, there are shots of twisted metal on the highway where motorists were driving seconds ago. Where people were waiting for the usual flight, a drama will unfold that will show that even experienced pilots and modern aircraft are not immune from a fatal combination of errors and technical failures. And this is the main paradox. Everything started as a routine, but turned into a tragedy. When it comes to aviation, especially large passenger planes, most people have a simple association: the older and more experienced the pilot, the safer the flight. Experience is a guarantee that a person will cope with any difficulties. In the case of flight RW9268, there were indeed people with great experience in the cabin. Their careers began back in the Soviet years. They went through dozens of types of aircraft, saw thunderstorms, landings at alternate airfields, and technical failures. But experience, as it turns out later, is not always a salvation. Sometimes it becomes a trap. The captain of the crew is 58-year-old Gennady Shmelev. A respectable age by the standards of civil aviation, years when thousands of flight hours have been flown. He went through everything from training Yak-18s to large airliners. His colleagues knew him as a demanding and tough man. He couldn't stand uncertainty in the cockpit. For him, discipline was the most important thing, and any mistake was perceived as a challenge to his authority. On the one hand, such qualities helped to keep the crew in good shape. On the other hand, they created tension and nervousness, especially for those who were sitting next to them. In the right seat is the co-pilot, 52-year-old Yevgeny Ostashenkov. The man is also experienced, but unlike the captain, he is more calm and balanced. He did not like conflicts, preferred to work according to instructions and without unnecessary emotions. But it was precisely this quality that often irritated Shmelev. He wanted to see a comrade in arms, who was ready to act decisively and quickly. And he perceived Yevgeny's calmness as slowness. And finally, the third crew member is 54-year-old flight engineer Igor Fisenko. His role in such flights is key, although for passengers it usually remains in the shadows. The engineer is responsible for all aircraft systems, fuel, engines, hydraulics, electronics. It is he who must monitor the operation of the machines in time and turn on or off the equipment manually at the right moment. You could say these are the eyes and hands of a machine. If the pilots are watching the sky and the trajectory, then the engineer is watching her inner heart. And here the first contrast arises. On the one hand, there are people who together have more experience than many young crews in the West. On the other hand, there is no harmony between them. It's not a cohesive team where one supports the other. These are three professionals, each with their own character, ambitions and fatigue. The day before, during the flight to the Czech Republic, there was already a conflict in the cabin. Errors in navigation and inaccurate actions of the co-pilot exasperated the captain. He sharply commented on the work of a colleague, and sometimes openly mocked. The atmosphere in the cabin was heavy. There was no clear call and response rhythm that was customary for pilots. There were remarks with irritation and irony. "Don't you know English?" says Shmelev angrily, unhappy with the way his partner communicates with the dispatchers. "I thought you were professionals," he adds. And it's not just an emotion. These are words that cut into the atmosphere and make the co-pilot even more insecure. Instead of cohesion, disunity appears. Instead of partnership, there is tension. This is important because aviation is built on trust. It is impossible to fly a modern aircraft alone. Even if the captain is an ace, he must rely on the co-pilot and the engineer. Any mistake made by one person should be noticed by the other, and the team should act as a single organism. Here, the body failed even before they entered the area of the Moscow approach. And again, the contrast. From the outside, to an observer, it looked like an exemplary crew, age, experience, discipline. But inside the cockpit, a different reality reigned: fatigue after the flight, the irritation of the captain, the uncertainty of the co-pilot and the silent concentration of the engineer, who had to play a key role in the final minutes. At that moment, none of them yet knew that in a matter of hours, it was this dynamic inside the cabin that would become the decisive factor. After all, when everything goes wrong, not only the technique will be important, but also how much people can agree with each other. Moscow greeted the crew unfriendly. The evening sky was overcast with grey clouds, the wind was picking up, and air traffic controllers were constantly adjusting routes for incoming planes. For pilots, all this is familiar. But it is in such conditions that the price of any small thing increases: an incorrectly heard course, a wrong parameter, a misunderstanding in the dialogue with the dispatcher. When flight RW9268 entered the Moscow approach area, the dispatch service gave the standard instruction: use the Ivanovsk 19A approach pattern. It's routine for the crew. You just need to enter the data into the navigation system and follow it. A simple task that has been performed dozens of times in a career. But it was at this moment that what had been hidden from the very beginning appeared: fatigue, irritation and insecurity. The co-pilot was supposed to enter new data, but got confused in the interface. This is not uncommon. The Tu-204 navigation systems, although modern by Russian standards, are still much more complex and less intuitive than on Western airliners. A lot depends on experience and reaction speed. The captain, noticing the hitch, decides to take over the controls. He is in a hurry, and in his haste he enters not Ivanovsk 19A, but Ivanovsk 19B. It would seem to be just one letter. But in aviation, one letter can mean a completely different route, a different trajectory, a different altitude. It's like confusing the address in the navigator and ending up on the opposite side of the city. The co-pilot notices the discrepancy. It seems to me that you have chosen Bravo. Yes, that's Bravo, the captain replies confidently. Well, Bravo, the co-pilot tries to laugh it off, but his voice sounds uncertain. The captain is annoyed. Damn it! A common situation that would have been resolved calmly in another situation escalates into an argument here. The co-pilot suggests checking with the dispatcher. The captain resists, confident that everything is going right. But the dispatch service insists, no, this is Ivanovsk 19A. Are you familiar with this scheme? The dispatcher asks. Yes, we know each other, the co-pilot replies. And he adds, it's actually the best option. The irony of the situation is that in fact the crew was not ready for this particular scheme. The captain is annoyed that he is being corrected. The co-pilot feels that things are not going according to plan. The atmosphere in the cabin is becoming increasingly tense. Instead of coherence, there is an argument. Instead of confidence, there is mutual irritation. From the outside, to the dispatchers, it looks like a common technical issue. There are hundreds of such dialogues on the air every day. But something accumulates inside the cabin that will later become a critical factor. Every such remark is a loss of concentration. And losing concentration in conditions of deteriorating weather can be too expensive. Technically, the situation is still under control. The plane continues to descend, the course is set, the patterns are clear. But the captain is already getting annoyed in his head. Why is everything not going as smoothly as it should? Why is my partner procrastinating again? Why do the dispatchers make amendments? At his age and with his experience, such moments are painful. And here's the contrast. From the outside, everything looks normal: navigation lights, familiar commands, normal descent rate. But emotions are boiling inside the cabin. It would seem that the route error has been fixed, but the nervousness remains. And this is just the beginning. Soon, the crew will have to face a much more serious challenge: the weather, which will literally play against them. But the most dangerous thing at this moment is not the snow or the wind. The most dangerous thing is that inside the cockpit, the team ceases to be a team. When RW9268 approached Moscow, the dispatchers already knew that the weather conditions were rapidly deteriorating. According to the forecast, a strong crosswind was expected, but the actual data showed an even more dangerous picture: squall gusts, in some places exceeding the permissible standards for landing the Tu-204. For the pilots, it should have sounded like an alarm. In aviation, a crosswind is considered one of the most difficult factors during landing. The aircraft can only withstand a certain angle and side load force. If the wind is stronger, the risk of the car being blown off the runway or turned around on the ground becomes too great. It is for such cases that each flight has alternate airfields. Pilots can leave at any time for a second lap, and then to another airport where conditions are safer. This is not considered a mistake or weakness. On the contrary, it is professionalism, the ability to recognize that the elements are stronger. But in the cabin of the RW9268, this rule was ignored. The dispatcher reports, "The wind is picking up, a side gust is out of tolerance." There is a short pause in the cabin. The co-pilot, according to the instructions, had to offer to leave for an alternate airfield. But the captain is silent. And the silence on the air turns into an invisible barrier. The proposal has not been made. Why? There is no definite answer to this question. Perhaps it was fatigue that played a role. The crew wanted to finish the flight as soon as possible and return home. Perhaps the captain could take pride in leaving for an alternate airfield as a defeat, as an admission that he had failed. Perhaps the psychology of the old school also played a role, when a pilot believes that experience and willpower can overcome any circumstances. The contrast here is stunning. Outside, there is an element that cannot be controlled. The wind is whistling over Vnukovo Airfield, whirling snow eddies. On the dispatcher's radars, red marks indicate critical values. And inside the cabin, there is a stubborn desire to bring the landing to an end. The engineer fixes the parameters: speed, pressure, system operation. Everything is fine so far. The plane is steadily heading for the glide path. And it is precisely this appearance of stability that is deceptive. The danger has not yet fully manifested itself. It's as if she's waiting for the pilots to take the decisive step, and then she'll strike unexpectedly. The dispatcher repeats the warning: wind, side gust, exceeds the norm. In response, the crew only confirms that they are ready to land. Not a single doubt, not a single hint that they are considering a backup option. This decision can be compared to a chess move, when a player consciously turns a blind eye to a threat. Everything seems to be under control, but after a few moves the game turns into a disaster. The irony is that right now the crew had the last chance to avoid a tragedy. If they had decided to step aside, the flight would have ended with only a slight delay. There were no passengers anyway, no one would have been hurt. The maximum is a couple of extra hours in the sky. But instead, the pilots chose to go all their way. Emotions in the cockpit remain tense. The captain gets nervous, hurries the co-pilot, cuts off his lines. Where there should be coherence, a tense dialogue continues. And all this is happening against the backdrop of a real threat that they decide to ignore. The contrast reaches its peak. Dispatchers armed with radars and instruments see the danger and warn. A crew with experience and knowledge hears these warnings and still acts as if they don't exist. Human stubbornness engages in battle with the elements. And the elements always play by their own rules. On approach to the runway, the crew of the RW9268 had to keep a strictly defined speed. About 230 km per hour was considered safe for the Tu-204 on approach in crosswind conditions and heavy loading of systems. This figure is not accidental, it has been verified by dozens of calculations. Less, the plane may lose lift and crash. More, the mileage increases dramatically after landing, which means there is less chance to stop in the lane. But keeping up speed at a critical moment proved to be a difficult task. The wind knocked down readings, the automation reacted with a delay, and the captain was too tense to entrust the correction to the co-pilot. All the attention in the cockpit was focused on the instrument arrows. "Don't slow down," the co-pilot insists, seeing the numbers start to drop. "Shut up," the captain snaps irritably. 240 is growing. The second one continues to report. "Damn you," Shmelev blurts out. Each new node of speed is like a knife to the nerves. In the cockpit, you can hear the numbers being announced out loud, almost like a time counter. 220, 230, 250 again. In these seconds, controlling the liner turns into balancing on a fine line. And now, the lights of the strip are right under the nose. Their height drops, 15 meters, 10, 5, the liner touches the ground. But not where it should be. Due to their high speed and wind drift, the captain missed the beginning of the lane by almost 1,000 meters. This means that instead of 4 kilometers of concrete track for the run, the crew has only about 2. Under normal conditions, this is more than enough. But not when the plane is rushing at an extra tens of kilometers of speed and a crosswind lifting one wing. The landing feels soft. The chassis touches the concrete without impact, the liner smoothly rests on the wheels. It would look perfect for a passenger. But this is where the paradox lies. A soft landing at excessive speed is often more dangerous than a hard one. Softness takes away the precious meters of lane that are needed for braking. The situation is aggravated by the fact that the right landing gear did not completely press down to the ground, a strong gust of wind kept it in the air. This means that the automatic system does not allow the release of interceptors, the so-called spoilers, which dampen lift and transfer the weight of the aircraft to the wheels. Without them, the brakes are ineffective and the thrust reversal is blocked. The engineer could have manually released spoilers at this point, but seconds are running out. The car is rolling, the wind is pulling it sideways, and the captain is nervously trying to turn on the reverse gear. However, the automation perceives this as a command to take off. The engines begin to accelerate. Instead of braking, the liner gets thrust forward. Panic is growing in the cabin. No one understands why the system reacts the way it does. Textbooks do not prescribe such scenarios, and simulators do not simulate such situations. Everything looks like a technical absurdity. The captain tries to turn on the reverse 3 times, and 3 times the plane reacts in the opposite way. Meanwhile, the speed is still high. 230, 220. The band is getting smaller. The dispatchers are watching what is happening, but there is nothing they can do to help. This is the moment when the struggle of man with the machine and the elements merges into one knot, and each new meter of mileage brings us closer to the denouement. For uninitiated passengers, thrust reversal is something invisible. After landing, only the sharp roar of the engines is heard as their flow is redirected forward, helping the brakes to stop the multi-ton aircraft. But in the cockpit, this is one of the key safety elements. Without a reverse, the liner often lacks a lane length. On the RW9268, the reverse was programmed to work only after touching all the landing gear struts. The logic is simple: while at least one rack is in the air, the system believes that the plane has not landed completely yet. But it was this logic that became the death trap. The right pillar was still hanging above the concrete, held aloft by a crosswind, and the automatic refused to unlock the reverse. The captain nervously pulls the levers. Reverse. In response, not braking, but acceleration. The PS-90's engines, powerful and moody, begin to unwind, as if the plane were about to take to the sky again. Panic instantly grows in the cabin. The co-pilot does not understand what is happening. It is not turned on. Reverse is not enabled. The engineer frantically looks at the instruments, sees that the automation is blocking the command. But there is no time for analysis. The captain pulls the levers again. The second time. Third. The reaction is the same every time. Instead of braking, the liner gets accelerated. To the pilots, it looks like a mockery. They do everything right, and the system responds with the opposite action. The situation is becoming absurd. A giant plane, which should be slowing down, continues to rush along the runway at a speed of almost 200 km per hour. The interceptors are still not released. The weight of the aircraft is not fully on the wheels, the brakes are half working. And here the main paradox of aviation manifests itself. The aircraft is designed to be as safe as possible, each system is duplicated and checked. But in reality, it turns out that overly complex automation becomes the enemy in an extreme situation. The man shouts, "Stop," and the car hears, "Take off." Chaos is growing in the cabin. The reverse is not working, the engineer shouts. "Brakes! Try the brakes! Turn off the engines," the captain finally orders. But the seconds are running out. There are fewer and fewer lanes left. The speed indicator shows 190. This is enough for the car in front to shatter into splinters. And there is no concrete ahead, but a fence and a ditch. Outside, the controllers are watching the lights of the plane and realize that it is not slowing down as it should. But they can no longer help. Everything is decided by the last moments in the cockpit. This is the moment when a person and a machine cease to understand each other. The pilots are doing everything they can to stop the giant machine, but the plane seems to be living its own life. Every meter of the lane goes under the wheels, and in front there is only a concrete fence and a highway where ordinary cars are driving, not even suspecting that a huge airliner is rushing towards them. The concrete strip under the wheels ended rapidly. A few seconds ago, there were 2 kilometers left, now it's less than a kilometer. For an airplane traveling at 190 kilometers per hour, this means one thing: there is no way back. The captain makes one last desperate attempt. He orders, "Turn off the engines." The co-pilot reaches for the switches. The row of the PS-90 is fading, but now the multi-ton liner is rolling by inertia, and its mass is still pushing forward, like a huge train that has lost its brakes. The engineer shouts, "Reverse! It won't turn on. Lock! Try the brakes." The cabin turns into a chaos of short, sharp commands. No one thinks about the rules of radio communication anymore. There is no time for calm phrases like "accepted" or "understood." Everything sounds nervous, abrupt, like a countdown before a collision. 190, 180. The speed drops too slowly. The interceptors finally open, the plane is pressing down to the ground, but it's too late. The strip lights stop, and there's a concrete fence ahead. At this moment, passengers, if they were on board, would feel a powerful push forward as the seat belts dig into their chests. But the salon is empty. The only people struggling with the car in those seconds are the very people who were supposed to bring her home. Hit. The Tu-204 crunches through the airfield fence. Metal structures fly apart like matchsticks. The next meters are earth and snow, which are not intended to stop the liner. The wheels dig the ground, the plane crashes into a ditch. The cabin shudders. Metal creaks and breaks, and systems are triggered that can no longer save the situation. One of the engines breaks off, the fuselage cracks. And at the same moment, the huge machine, which had been pointedly obedient a minute ago, turns into a pile of twisted metal. Cars are moving on the next highway at this moment. People see a giant shadow in the dark that flies outside the airport. For them, it looks like a nightmare. A plane that should be in the sky is rushing straight towards the road. Fortunately, he doesn't reach the cars, he stops in a ditch by the curb. But the cost of this shutdown turns out to be too high. In the cockpit, chaos is replaced by silence. The hum of the engines died down. Only the smell of kerosene and the crackle of debris in the frosty air remind us that a desperate struggle was going on here a second ago. The contrast is striking. Outside is New Year's Moscow, people are buying tangerines, gathering at the table, turning on the TV. And just a few kilometers away, a giant airliner lies in the snow, broken like a child's toy. And this is just the beginning of the questions. How did experienced pilots find themselves in such a situation? Why did the equipment fail? And could it all have ended differently? In the first hours after the disaster, many wondered, how could it happen that a modern liner with an experienced crew ended up in a ditch near the Moscow highway? The answer seemed complicated, almost mystical. But when the experts started to pick up the documents, it became clear, this story has almost happened before. Just 9 days earlier, another plane of the same airline, also a Tu-204, was flying to Novosibirsk. Everything was frighteningly similar there. The plane landed at high speed, the automation refused to release spoilers, the reverse did not work on time. The airliner streaked 300 meters beyond the runway, tearing through snow and earth. Fortunately, there were no obstacles in his way, and the disaster was avoided. The crew then, though in a panic, managed to slow down the car. No one was injured, and they turned a blind eye to this episode. But this is the main paradox. Where alarms should have sounded and immediate checks should have followed, everything was limited to the formal recording of the incident. The plane was returned to service, the report was issued, and life moved on. There was no additional training for engineers to manually release spoilers, and there were no urgent directives for pilots. It seemed that once everything was all right, you could exhale. And 9 days later, everything happened again, only this time in conditions where the price was much higher. The contrast between the two events is striking. In Novosibirsk, the liner rolled out, but remained on a flat platform. In Moscow, there was a busy highway and a deep ditch ahead. There's luck, here's tragedy. It ended up as almost an incident there, but it became national news here. It is precisely such coincidences that show that disasters are rarely unique. They consist of a chain of signals that have been ignored. First, a small alarm bell, then a second, a third. And if they are not heard, the finale becomes inevitable. At that moment, the Tu-204 was perceived as a car with a future. But now there are whispers in the aviation community, doesn't he have too many coincidences? Doesn't he behave the same way too often at critical moments? The irony is that both planes were new. The liner that crashed in Moscow rolled off the assembly line just 4 years earlier. He drove the football team and was shown as an example of the modern Russian aviation industry. But the result turned out to be completely different from what the designers had intended. This comparison with Novosibirsk was the key to understanding that what happened in Moscow was not an accident, but a repetition of the scenario. And the question now wasn't, why did this happen, but why didn't anyone stop it sooner? When the wreckage of the liner was still lying by the highway, and firefighters were watering the icy metal, what always follows a tragedy in aviation began, an investigation. The Interstate Aviation Committee got involved in the case. The experts collected the black boxes, analyzed the crew's negotiations, and brought up documents about previous incidents. The cockpit recordings left no doubt, human factors played a key role. The captain, known for his harshness, did not listen to the co-pilot at a critical moment and cut off his remarks. Instead of constructive dialogue, there were altercations. The co-pilot, feeling the pressure, did not dare to insist on leaving for an alternate airfield. The engineer did not release spoilers manually when it could have turned the situation around. But the blame could not lie solely on the shoulders of people. The investigation showed that the reverse lock did not work correctly. The automation algorithm turned out to be too rigid. She perceived the captain's commands not as a deceleration signal, but as preparation for a second takeoff. As a result, the crew found themselves in a situation that the training programs did not provide for. They weren't trained on simulators to deal with such a scenario. And here's the main question: why? Why were no changes made after the incident in Novosibirsk? Why weren't engineers required to check the manual release of the interceptors on every flight? Why didn't the pilots receive additional instructions? The answers were uncomfortable. In a hurry and with limited resources, the airline did not pay due attention to the alarm. A special irony was added by the fact that Captain Shmelev had been tested shortly before the tragedy. His landing then was also carried out overspeeding and touching the runway late. But the reports were highly rated. no one noticed that such habits could turn into trouble. For the Tu-204, this disaster was a severe blow to its reputation. The plane, which was conceived as the pride of the Russian aviation industry, was now associated with malfunctions and accidents. The consequences for Red Wings Airline were even more severe. After a series of incidents, the Federal Air Transport Agency temporarily suspended the operation of its fleet. But behind the figures of the reports and the dry formulations, human destinies remained. People who lived in aviation, who worked in the sky for decades, found themselves victims of a system where experience and pride intersected with fatigue and technical failures. The contrast of the ending is striking. Moscow was preparing to celebrate the new year, the streets were ablaze with lights, televisions were showing concerts and congratulations. And at the same time, next to a busy highway, there was a charred fuselage of an airplane that had recently transported the national team. And if their holiday was a joy for millions, then for those who were associated with this flight, it became a black date. The investigation concluded with the following conclusions: malfunction of the reverse mechanism, crew errors, and training deficiencies. But the main question remained in the air: could the tragedy have been prevented? After all, if fate had given you a chance to fix the situation 9 days earlier, why was this chance missed? And perhaps this is the hardest lesson of that winter: there are no accidents in aviation. There are chains of events that either break in time, or they lead to the fact that the routine turns into a disaster.